Please turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Last week we finished on a bit of a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So we're going to pick up in verse 48 and complete the chapter, and then, as I was saying earlier, we're going to stop at that point, and then we're going to go back through the chapter again a lot quicker, but with a little bit different perspective. And we're going to draw some specific steps that I see in the chapter for facing the bullies in our life. So to bring us up to speed, in chapter 17, we have the Philistines. Once again, at this point in Israel's history, they are the arch enemy of the people of God, and they are amassed on one mountain or one hill, and Israel is on another, and there is a plain in between. So it forms somewhat of a valley there, and during this time there was, and later in history, there was this process where some nations would have single warrior versus single warrior battle, rather than having everybody go at it, and they would wage, whatever the terms of the battle were upon the outcome of this man-on-man battle. And looking at this from the human standpoint, the Philistines had made the right decision. They had a guy well over 9 foot tall who is a lifetime warrior. And in our passage, they call him their champion. And the term that we translate champion means a man in between. And he certainly, and so that fortifies that concept of the two armies, one on each side, and he would be the man that would go in between the armies to face the man in between from the other side. And I want to pick up reading in verse 41, and then we'll pick up the teaching shortly after that. So I'll read this first section. And the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air, and to the beasts of the field." Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut your head off. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." So just to recap briefly, and I'm going to shut that door. To recap briefly, the Israelites were terrified by Goliath. And he had been coming out every day for 40 days. And he is taunting the nation. That's about the detail that we're given, other than a few words. we can picture in our mind the kind of thing this guy would say to try to get under their skin, right? Day after day after day after day, this guy comes out and talks trash. And there's not a man in more than likely a couple 100,000 Israelites that says, I'll face that guy. Not a single man. David, going back and forth between keeping the sheep and playing music for Saul, his father tells him, go down to the battle, bring this bread to your brothers, and these cheeses to the commander of their regiment, and bring back a token, bring back something that lets me know how they're doing. And so he's just going out there, you know, with no intent in getting involved in this battle whatsoever. And we call this the providence of God. He happens to show up right at the time that Goliath is coming forward and repeating his daily taunt. David has been anointed by God. He knows God's got something special for him. And he's had experience after experience of dealing with very difficult things. And although he's a young man, he is a young man of courage. And so when the Philistine threatens him, first he disdains him, right? He's thinking they're going to send some big buff guy out who's been, you know, a warrior and has so many kills or whatever. And David walks out, and whether he was small, I don't think he was really small, to be honest with you, but obviously looked very young, and he's not coming out in armor, and he's not coming out with any weaponry per se. He's coming out with his shepherd's staff, he's coming out with a sling, and it's as if Goliath is offended by this. He's like, really? All right, come on over here. I'm just going to take care of you right now, and then we're going to continue this taunt, right? And David is not, it doesn't appear that he's afraid at all. He just says, look, you come at me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, I come into you in the name of the Lord, our God. You're done. You know, you have done this long enough. You're going to be taken care of today. Not only that, but the army of the Philistines are going to be eaten by the birds of the air and the beasts of the field when we're done with it. And that brings us up to verse 48. And if I could get somebody to just read verses 48 and 49.
So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth.
Thank you. So it's on. The time is here. They're facing each other. The Philistine comes upon him to meet David, and David knows exactly how to handle the bully, and that is head on. David rushes to the line, and that's the line between the two armies there, and reaches into his bag and pulls out one of those stones, puts it into his sling, a couple of swings around his head, and that thing is flying. Researchers say that they could sling these stones over 100 miles an hour. Now the movies and the pictures and whatnot that I've seen have all shown Goliath in his helmet, and it's all got a little opening right here on his forehead for a stone to go through. I don't think that was necessary. I think that he could have his bronze helmet on and a stone, let's just say a stone, I don't know, 2 inches in diameter,
Still is going in there.
at 100 miles an hour, bronze helmet or not, that's gonna ring this guy's bell.
Yeah, bronze is soft.
And it does, right? He takes him out with one shot. And back in the book of Judges, we read that there were men in the tribe of Benjamin, and they were touting how well these guys were trained as fighters. It said even left-handed, they could sling a stone with a sling and hit a target as wide, as narrow as a human hair. Now, obviously, that's a little hyperbole. The point is, the people that use these things were deadly accurate with them. And I can imagine David out there with his sheep, day after day after day after day. What's he doing? He's messing around. I mean, he's got his sheep, they're doing fine.
Playing on his tablet.
Right? Yeah, he's not updating Facebook with his status. So he's got his sling out there and he's knocking off sticks here and there, and he's probably got years of practice with this thing. And so if you look at it just from the standpoint of weapon versus weapon, David actually has the upper hand. He's going to a knife fight with a 45. It's like, dude, you showed up with the wrong weapon. And David takes him out. And one shot, it strikes the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face first on the ground. Can we get someone to read verses 50 through 54?
So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from his sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strung along the Shaharim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put the Philistine's weapon in his own tent.
Thank you. So the irony of it all, young David prevails over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Remember earlier we were talking about the difference in weaponry. At this time, the Philistines were the only people in the area that had a grasp on Iron Age technology. And further, they were oppressive over Israel and would not allow the Israelites to develop in that way. So it had mentioned earlier that if the Israelites had a plow that they purchased and been made out of iron and it needed to be sharpened, they didn't have the whereabouts to do that. So they would have to take it back to the Philistines and pay an exorbitant amount to have that plow sharpened, or whether it was a hoe or any other field instrument that they had. That's the process that they had to go through. And it said that Jonathan and Saul were the only people out of the entire army that had swords. And so we see that contrast here. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Verse 51, then David ran and stood over the Philistine and drew his sword out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So David knocks him down, and it's not certain whether the man is dead or not. we're not sure, and I don't think David was sure. So he took care of it right then. He didn't walk over there casually, look what I did. He took care of business right now. He ran up, he drew Goliath's own sword out. You know, it's interesting, you don't read anything about Goliath's armor bearer at this point, right? Because earlier it said he was advancing and his armor bearer was in front of him. I don't know, the armor bearer took off, man. He's like, I'm not messing with this kid, you know. David cuts the guy's head off, so even if he were just stunned and you know, knocked unconscious by the stone, he's laying there and David's free to do what he wants, and he does. And he cuts the man's head off, and then that rallies the troops. So the end of verse 51 says, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded of the Philistines fell on the way from Sheah-Raim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their camp. So they had earlier said, hey, if you know we win, we'll be your slaves. If you win, you be our slaves. They had apparently no intent on, you know, fulfilling their side of the bargain. They just figured that they were going to win, right? And when they see that they lost, they're like, we're out of here. Mm-hmm. And they run, and now the Israelites pursue them, and you know there is the picture here that we envision is that from the place of the battle all the way back to their cities on the coast, it's just strewn with dead bodies. You know, for miles and miles, there's a dead body here and a dead body there, as the Israelites struck them down as they chased them. And then verse 54, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. Now, this is a bit odd, because Jerusalem at this point is not an Israelite city. So we're not sure if this is referring to something that had happened later, or that he had possibly, you know, his family had some property in Jerusalem. Who knows? But later, David, when he becomes king, will invade Jerusalem and win it from the Jebusites, and it becomes Israel territory and remains to this day. I mean, obviously it didn't for 1900 years or so until they came back in 1948. Just a point on that bringing his head to Jerusalem. And then can we get somebody to finish up the chapter, verses 55 through the end of the chapter?
Real quick though.
Manny?
Just two things I was curious about, just come to mind. For one thing, I think Goliath got too cocky. Apparently he didn't take his sword out. So I'm thinking he probably took off his helmet also, thinking, hey, I'm gonna whip your butt with my hands.
You never know.
Well, I'm just going through my mind. But
Yeah,
secondly, on this one
he's
here,
a bully.
secondly,
right?
on this one goes to my mind with the head going to Jerusalem. He's sending a message. Your league man, whatever you call it, he's dead.
Yeah. The only thing is Jerusalem's on the other side of, the Philistines are on the coast, and Jerusalem, the battle is here, and Jerusalem's over here, as far as that goes. Hard to say, but definitely Goliath didn't take him seriously.
You know, one of the movies, I know it's just a movie, but one of the movies I was watching with David and Goliath, where basically Goliath was taunting David, just kind of tauntingly swinging his sword.
Yeah, I
walking
watched
around
some
in
stuff. It was all
circles, and
crazy.
then finally David's like, I've had enough. Bam!
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah, you know, we dramatize that stuff to make it interesting. It's hard to say what the details that are left out here were specifically took place, but what we do know is Goliath didn't take him seriously, and that was his mistake. So can we get somebody to read those last couple of verses? Somebody named Manny, maybe?
Okay. What are we reading, 55?
Yeah, 55 through 58.
Okay. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.
Thank you. So Saul is standing back watching, and as we saw when Saul was originally chosen, he was head and shoulders above, taller than anybody else. He would have been the natural choice of the Israelites to defend his country. And had he done that, how he would have won the hearts of his men. But he's watching. So he sees the victory, and he says to Abner, who's this guy's dad? And Abner says, I don't know. Right? As your soul lives, I do not know.
Bob, isn't that the second time the king asked him whose dad was? Didn't he reference that earlier in like 14
No,
or 15?
he had, he didn't know, yeah, earlier, let's see. I'm not sure at this point. I'm going to reference something back from 16 here shortly,
Okay.
where, yeah, he did ask whose son he was, and then he spoke to him.
Yeah, you see.
Yeah, verse 16,
Mm-hmm.
or excuse me, chapter 16, right around verse 15. So we have what appears as a contradiction, because
Right.
in the previous chapter, it says, toward the end of the chapter, verse 21 through, and I'll read, and David came to Saul and entered his service. He was as a musician.
Mm-hmm.
And Saul greatly loved him, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David remain in my service,
Right.
for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand, so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. And then we have, whose son is this youth? There's a couple of things to look at here. One, he's not asking who David is. He's asking whose son he is, right? He's had David in his service. He's had one interaction with his father, and the time between him coming into Saul's service and this time could have been a couple of years. It's not necessarily like 4 days later, right? So, and as we were reading through this, let's see, at one point it said now that the brothers had gone to the battle, and verse 15 it says, the end of 14 says, the youngest three followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So during that time of David's service, he wasn't in Saul's court 24/7, right? He would be there, and then he would go back and take care of the sheep, and then he'd go over there and he'd minister to Saul, and he'd go back and forth, right? And so, the king, this is one of the king's servants.
He knows David pretty well, though. He says he's a brave man and a warrior.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't necessarily know, Saul doesn't necessarily know David all that well. He knows that he's a musician, and they have conversed. It says that he loved him, right? And most likely what that means is he loved the service that he was giving him. He's tormented, and when David comes in, this music, restores him. But the point of that is, he's asking who his father is. Why would he be asking who his father is?
Want to know who raised such fine sons.
Remember earlier, what will be done for the man who,
No taxes?
No taxes, the
for
wife,
his family,
his daughter.
and marry his daughter? So who is David's family? His father, all his brothers, their families, right? So he's like, at some point, we're gonna have to fulfill this. Make sure you get that guy's info so that we can, you know, do our part. We've set a vow, make sure you get it, because we're gonna fulfill our part. And we're gonna make sure that, you know, the records show that that family is exempt from taxes in Israel. So I'm satisfied with that. And I was not immediately satisfied the first time I read through that. I have gone back and forth between those two passages. I'm comfortable with that. And so they inquire, and as soon as David returned from striking the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And Abner is the commander of Saul's entire army, with the head of the Philistine still in his hand. See, now up in verse 54 it said, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. So we can see that at some point he took the head to Jerusalem, but not yet, because right now he's taking it over to, it's not like he stopped the battle and goes, well, I'm going to Jerusalem while you guys fight, because I'm going to take this head over here, right? The writer isn't necessarily giving us a chronological account. What he's doing is he's giving us a theological account. He's giving us an account from a religious viewpoint. And he's putting the details in. There's a lot of details that our Western minds would like to know. Okay? We don't get them. They didn't care. He has a story to tell from a certain perspective. When we're not going to go through them, but if we were to go through the Kings and the Chronicles, they don't rate the kings by how well the people did and how was the economy and what was the crime rate. These kings are each rated by how well they served God. If he served God and he did the right things before God, it says he was a successful king. And if they abandoned the ways of the Lord to do other things, it says he was an unsuccessful king. So we have to remember, when we read the history in the Old Testament, we're not reading a secular history. We're reading history from the viewpoint of the people of God, and we're getting the story told for specific reasons, not to give us a chronological order of the events of the nation of Israel. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. That'd be a big book.
Yeah, it would. So when he asked David himself, whose son are you, young man? David answers, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Log it, right? Log that word, because that's the one who's going to be relieved from the taxes going forward.